All right. Welcome everyone to another wonderful episode of Sustainable in the City here on a Wednesday afternoon. Get your lunch, get excited, get settled. Let folks trickle in as always. Gonna have a fantastic episode today, as I always say. Allie, my darling, how are you doing today?
Doing good. It's March, which is surprising. I feel like, how is it already? It's not quite the middle of March, but this time of year kind of swings or flies by when you're transitioning from winter to spring.
Yes. I do like the swing idea. It swings by.
Well, we're swinging into spring.
Yeah.
What I'm not excited about is the time change coming up, or the spring forward.
Yes.
It's like you get used to everything and then it changes.
Yep. Only constant in life is change.
This is true.
For sure.
Very philosophical.
Yes, that's me. That's why people show up to Sustainable in the City, is for the philosophy. So I appreciate that. Wonderful. Well, we have folks that are coming in rapidly, so we'll just basically get started in just a second here. As always, we welcome everyone and thank you for taking the time to spend your lunch break or spend a little bit of your afternoon with us. We don't take it lightly, so thank you so much. Welcome to today's show and today's episode. You are here at Sustainable in the City. We are excited to have Unearthing Joy's founder, Ashley Brailsford, here today to discuss the responsibility that we have in the sustainability space to make sure that our work is joyful, inclusive, relevant, culturally centered to the people who we are in community with. And speaking of community, this is a partnership between Zero Waste Nashville, which is Allie's organization, and Urban Green Lab, which is my organization. And we come together to talk about all things zero waste and sustainability in general in Nashville. And so we are, as always, very excited to have folks coming on in to have this important conversation today. And Allie, like you said, it's coming up on spring. It's coming up on spring. We got to bring a little joy. We got to bring a little light into this world. We're coming out of winter. And I'm excited about it. So why don't you let us know how the heck we can use the chat and the Q&A feature?
Yes, and as you'll notice, I no longer have our previous co-host, Jen Harmon, with us, but she is right there in the audience and did inform me that our chat is disabled. So I will, once I run through how the chat works and how the Q&A function works, I will go make sure it's actually functioning for you all. So as a reminder, we do, I will fix the chat so it's enabled. We do primarily use the Q&A function for any questions that you want to ask Ashley throughout the presentation. We will answer those at the end, but do be sure that you're putting questions in the Q&A rather than the chat. And if you want to strike up a conversation and don't necessarily have a direct question, you can put that in the chat and just make sure that you select everyone in the chat. And the great thing about the Q&A function is that you can upvote questions. So if you really see a question that you're excited about, go in there and upvote the question. And as I mentioned, we'll get to those at the end. And I'm going to fix the chat so we can get to our question to the audience. But in the meantime, you all can ponder this while we do some elevator music or something. But our question to the audience today is, where is your joyful space in nature? And just think about that for a moment while we get the chat going. Christina, where is your joyful space in nature?
Mine's right in my backyard. Get me on a hammock, looking at some birds flying around. The cardinals are like coming out in full force right now. Love it. I love seeing like their ebb and flow through the season because they're still here. They stay, but then they come back full force, chasing after each other. So if I am outside looking at some birds, I'm pretty joyful. Last night I was under the full moon, just like vibing, having a good time, thinking about philosophy. It was great. It was wonderful. Well, we haven't actually introduced you yet, Ashley, but you wanna hop in here and let the audience know where's your joyful space in nature?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question. I think like you, it's becoming right here in my yard. I just moved a couple of weeks ago to, well, a little less than 2 weeks ago, to Kingston Springs, which is outside of the city of Nashville. And I am like in a very tree lined area, wooded
Mm,
area. And so the deck on the back of the house is like all facing woods, and it's beautiful. And so I can't wait to have like all these rocking chairs I saw and just sit out there and enjoy just sitting out there. And so I being able to have that space in my own yard is nice. So
it's so nice. It's
And
so
let's
nice.
see, can folks,
Yeah.
oh, look at that. It looks like our chat is functioning. So we'll start to see those coming
Oops,
in.
I did this.
Uh,
Wonderful, wonderful. And you know what? You want to hear something wild? Now I can't send anything to anybody besides hosted panelists. So, Allie, why don't you send that into the chat? We pivot here, y'all. We know what we're doing, but
you can blame it on me as the newcomer.
we 100% blame Allie. No, so thank you all so much for coming. Please put that in the chat. We'd love to hear. We got Shelby Park, we got Warner Parks, of course. The greenways and the parks in and around Nashville are just stunning. So I would not be surprised to see everyone kind of answering those. Hiking in nature, yes. On the beach, Ursula, if there's a beach that we should be known about, put that in the chat, because I'm an East Coast girl and I don't know about any beaches around here. So let's do that. Hiking, garden, yes, next to a waterfall. Ooh, Beverly, what are you doing? I love it. So we have some wonderful things. Oh, Ursula's in Florida right now, so that's why she's getting a little beach action. Oh, all right. Now we have a compost bin, which gives me satisfaction that I'm doing the right thing. There you go. We're bringing in sustainability and nature and everything that we're talking about. That's a fantastic one to end on. So why don't we, if we're all set, I think, let's just hop right into our interview with our very lovely, wonderful guest that we have with us today. This is Unearthing Joy's founder, Ashley Brailsford. She has a wealth of knowledge of how to make nature programming and just spending time with, especially youth, but spending time with folks in nature and making sure that it is culturally relevant, culturally centered, and really making sure that folks are finding joy in those spaces. I have been so excited to get Ashley on this show, and this is so exciting to have her kind of right before we're getting into that springtime, to get y'all excited about spending some time respectfully and joyfully out in nature. So Ashley, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome.
yeah, thank you for having me.
Yes, yes. So we're going to do a little bit of an intro interview so you all can kind of know who you're speaking with or hearing from today, hear a little bit about her journey. And then she's going to go into a brief PowerPoint or presentation to give you a little bit more information. And then as always, we'll save time at the end for the Q&A part. So make sure you're getting your questions in for Ashley. She has a wealth of knowledge, and I'm sure she'll be excited to share that at the end if there's anything that she hasn't talked about already. So let's get going. Let's start. What has been your sustainability journey? How did you get here today?
Yeah, I think, the seeds were first planted by my grandparents. My grandparents, both maternal and paternal, were in rural areas in North and South Carolina. I grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina. But we would travel to see them, and they both lived on farms, and they were farmers. And so, of course, they saved everything. They preserved everything, right? The little tin can became the can for the bacon grease, and all of the things around was reused or repurposed. Everything was glass. There wasn't much plastic at all. I don't really remember that. But everything had a purpose. Even the animals that were harvested, or when we talk about composting, I heard somebody mention their compost piles. And so all of that, I think, initially planted those seeds of what sustainability means. And I think align with that as being self-determined in a lot of ways, and self-sufficient. And so, and then, of course, I was born in the 80s and grew up in the 90s. And I think at that time, there was a big push and a lot of initiatives around recycling programs and just taking care of the planet, and that a lot of us watch, right? Those programs on, I can remember Nickelodeon had a news broadcast for children, and it was often about things about the planet. And I think all of those things certainly shaped how I think about sustainability as well, and the importance of things like recycling and all of that. And then fast forward, right? I went to grad school at Indiana University, and as a PhD student, you don't, if you get paid anything, like it's peanuts, right? And so you're trying to save everything, and looking for ways to cut costs, and lo and behold, those are like some of the same things, right? That are what's considered to be sustainable, right? So I started a little garden, right? At that time, I went through the master gardening program, had a little garden going, and thought about how to utilize and reuse things I already had, because I didn't have the money to go, pay for other things. And so just kind of out of necessity at that time, being more cautious about what I was using and spending and reusing. But I'd say now, my I think conception of sustainability is more so focused on well-being and health. As you get older, you realize in order to sustain yourself, right, you got to take care of yourself. And so I think about that not for just myself, but for other folks as well. So what are you investing in? Are you investing in, if you can, mental health care, and massage therapy to me is no longer a luxury. It's a necessity to sustain, my physical well-being, and chiropractic care. So all of those things I think about, and I we'll talk a little bit more about that piece, I think, in a little bit.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Yeah, I appreciate kind of hearing that journey and seeing how, like a lot of folks, it's expanded and gotten broader, and kind of now probably touches almost every part of your life. And it's more of a lens as opposed to a checklist of things to do. And it's kind of like
Right.
remembering is a big part of that. And that I felt that a lot in your answer. So I appreciate that. So you're the founder of Unearthing Joy. Why did you feel like Unearthing Joy needed to exist? What need were you seeing that was not being filled?
Yeah, I feel like I have to give a little backstory here before I jump into that question. And really, I had spent years as an early childhood educator, working, both in the classroom, but then in higher ed for several years. And then worked for a national nonprofit doing family literacy work and program development work all across the country. And, the pandemic hits, and like many folks, I have a son, and he was 5 at the time. And, everything kind of was stationary. So he was at home. And the organization I was working for went through layoffs, and I was like, please pick me, because I was exhausted from all the travel. And so I told myself, here's an opportunity to really think about how do I, marry my love of the outdoors with education, because my background is not, it's not in environmental education or outdoor education in the like traditional trained sense. I had been an outdoor Afro leader for Nashville, which is a national nonprofit to reconnect Black folks to nature. And I had done that for a few years here in Nashville. And so I love that. And so I started thinking, as I looked at my son and him having all this time now not being in school, was like, okay, how can we spend more time outside? Because you're only getting 15 minutes to play outside a day, which is, I'm like, oh my goodness. And I've known this happens all across the country. And so I said, how can we spend more time outside together, learning together? And so through that, we just kind of rediscovered our joy. And then it became, okay, looking at the questions he was answering just from being outside and asking, was like, are there other parents who would want to be in community with us? Because I wasn't interested in sending him back to public school, because I knew it was going to be a mess. It was like, the pandemic was just rough. And so I said, okay, let's see if we could find other folks to be in community with, but probably outdoors is going to be the safest, right? To be in community with one another. So I started looking into outdoor education programs or nature programs. And honestly, they were really white, right? Like I didn't see other kids that looked like my son. And as someone who has done work and taught around culturally responsive teaching, I know a lot about the importance of identity development in children, right? Who they're around, how that shapes how we think, we see, how we act in this world. And I was like, ooh, I'm not convinced like those are the spaces where I want him to be the only one. And so I was like, okay, well, I'll create this once a week program. We'll meet at the garden. But what'll be different about it, and when I looked at other nature education programs, I was like, how are they talking about culture? How are they talking about Indigenous, Black folks, other people of the global majorities' connection to nature? And I wasn't seeing that in those programs. And so that's kind of where my background came into play. I used to teach around multicultural education in higher ed and the importance of that. And so inserting that lens into nature education and how I would develop the programs, and knowing that it was just as important for our children to see themselves in these spaces, and that we've always been connected to land. That's not a new thing for us. And to hear those stories was really important to me. So that's why, I started Unearthing Joy. And of course, the other piece to that was really to uplift joy in education, because it's been difficult for a lot of teachers, and the pressure of changes that are happening and continue to happen. But joy has to be central to the work that we do as educators, and the experiences that we provide to children and families as well.
Yeah, and it's such a beautiful moment when you get to see someone kind of find their niche or find that special thing that's not being offered or isn't there, and then you get to kind of bring it to life. And it's kind of like gardening. It's kind of, you got to bloom it out of kind of, nothing. Obviously there's tons of people around you and your education, but it's always really nice to hear that type of story, because there could be folks on here who are wishing, oh, I wish there was this that existed, I wish this existed. Here's maybe your sign that you can be that person to make it exist for other folks. And so it's really inspirational. I appreciate that. So we talked about this a little bit, but I would just love to know kind of how your work intersects with education in particular. So you talked about your background in higher ed and bringing in that culturally inclusive and that lens of culture to the education. Can you just talk about what is the education, not necessarily even outcomes, but just like what kind of like that bread and butter education looks like in your programming?
Yeah, so I'll start by talking about the adult piece, because usually people think I just work with children and families. And honestly, that's probably 10% of my work is the program I do at the garden. Most of the work that I do is workshops and program development with organizations. And so a lot of that education piece is for adults around how do you create culturally centered nature programs. And so when I work with organizations, we walk through these different strategies of looking at first, what are you already doing? But then when we look at this approach, which you'll see a little bit here, I'll talk about what that approach is. When you look at your programming through that lens, where are the opportunities to improve it, to transform it, right? To align it more with justice-based initiatives. It doesn't matter what sector you're in this space. I think that's an important piece to our work. So yeah, that adult piece in terms of education is a lot around looking at our programming and aligning more of the strategies to make it more culturally centered, right? Now, when we look at that 10% where I do the programming with families and children, That's once a week during the spring and the fall for like 8-week sessions. I have a morning enrichment program and an after school enrichment program. And to me, that's an opportunity. I call it my demonstration lab, right? I didn't want to be one of these people that went out and talked theoretically about their work. Like theoretically, this is what it should look like, without having concrete examples or without being able to say, I actually do this, right? And this is what it looks like in practice. And for me, it's also an opportunity to stay connected to children and families, because that's going to inform how I talk about the work, how I do the work, how it continues to evolve. I think that piece is so critical to continue to be one that facilitates learning with children and families. So in those programs, it looks like inviting guest facilitators in who, of course, are representative of the children in our community. And so I very intentionally find or try to find Indigenous, Black, and other people of the global majority to facilitate some of the topics that we're talking about, right? I intentionally find multicultural literature books that are connected to nature, high quality ones that not only feature us, but were written by us, right? That's a big, important piece I want people to really think about when you're looking at literature to share with children. Who wrote the stories, right? Are we able and allowed to share and write our own stories? And then the other thing that I think is a practice in terms of the educative experience with us is the interactive piece, right? So it's not just us standing up there giving information, but the children are engaged in scavenger hunts, and they're engaged in, whether it's planting or sometimes it's just digging in the dirt, right? Like they figure out what is of interest to them and explore that. And the after school enrichment program is also an opportunity that happens at Brooklyn Heights Community Garden as well, but it's an opportunity to work more with the children in North Nashville in that community. And so those kids that come to that program, we partner with the Center for Imagination. They're a little older. And so what that experience is starting to look like is they're more in charge of their learning and the questions of that program. That's what we're going through this spring, is starting out by not me saying this is what we're going to learn, but rather, what are your questions around animals? What do you notice in your neighborhood about animal habitat? And then developing that curriculum and that program based on their interest, based on their learning. So that's been fun to explore. So I say all that to say my approach is ever evolving as it should be. And so that's where we are at this moment.
Yes, constantly evolving. So I'm sure we talk to you in 6 months and you'll have a whole new suite of things that you're doing. So you have to stay up to date on what Ashley and her organization is doing. So thank you for making that correction of kind of how much you spend with organizations and how much you spend with students and children. So I appreciate that. And so this next question goes into that a little bit more. Why should organizations in particular who are working in natural spaces be aware and take advantage of the work that you all are putting forward?
I think first for the people who are Black, who are Indigenous, who are of the global majority, it's important for us to reclaim our narratives and our sense of belonging in these natural spaces, right? And that's really important because sometimes we don't see ourselves in these spaces, or often we don't see ourselves in certain spaces, so we don't interact with them, or we don't get to visit, or we don't feel comfortable for a lot of reasons we'll go into in a little bit. But I think that reclaiming is really important. And so when organizations are looking at opportunities to center the stories of Indigenous, Black, and other people of the global majority, it begins to, I think, raise interest as well as acknowledgement and welcoming, creating a welcoming environment where people who may not have been so interested before may say, I want to know more about that, right? And so I think that reclamation is really important. I think the other piece to that is, of course, when we see ourselves in that space, then we have the opportunity, at least is what I'm hoping for children and youth, and I'm seeing it in adults as well, is how can I now be that environmental educator? How can I now be that garden educator or that farmer or whatever that naturalist, whatever that role is, right? The person working on water equity. And when we do those things, right? When we're telling those stories and when we can see ourselves, then we can see what we're able to be or how we're able to participate. And it's not always formal roles, right? Like we don't always have to be in a formal role. Maybe I just want to enjoy fishing. Maybe I just want to enjoy looking at birds and paying attention to that to support my mental health, right? Or my emotional health. So I think there's so many reasons why organizations should seek to really center our stories that pay off. And I think the biggest, of course, that I'm going to promote is joy, right? And so the joy of nature is there once you understand it in terms of its ability to uplift and be inviting. And that's ultimately how we get to justice, right? When people are joyful in these spaces and feel like they are welcomed in those environments or have access to contribute to the issues in our environments, right? Then that to me is the ultimate piece to judge.
Yeah, and I appreciate that specific link to justice, because I think with especially when you're talking about sustainability and environmental justice and environmental racism, there are these exceptionally heavy topics. Of course, I mean, this is history that we have to grapple with, and not even history, excuse me, it's present. But wouldn't it be better to say, hey, well, let's do this in a welcoming, joyful way where we all can get together and respect each other and make this into something where we're all having a good time. Like it's heavy. We need to respect it. It's something that is serious, but there's something to that joy aspect of come on over here. Doesn't this look fun? Doesn't this look better than maybe the way that things have been going? So I appreciate that centered of joy and justice. And so you touched on it a little bit, but there's a conversation around the concept of nature gap, and which is kind of traditionally thought of as the idea of people of color are less likely to engage in nature-based outdoor recreation activities. That's kind of like the traditional way of thinking about it. At Unearthing Joy, what does the conversation around the nature gap traditionally miss or leave out of the conversation? And can you explain how you either define this concept or how you're working to address it? So kind of maybe what the conversation is missing and what you're hoping to bring to it.
Yeah, I think traditionally that conversation, at least when I've heard it or read about it, has put the onus of the lack of interest, so to speak, or engagement with nature on minoritized populations, right? Those have been historically excluded. And so what those statements do is make it seem like organizations need to, just get more people to the park or just get more people to their thing and it'll be all good. And it's like, well, no, there's a lot of work here that has to be done around acknowledging, past acts of violence in nature, whether we're talking about lynchings, whether we're talking about stealing land, whether we're talking about all kinds of things that have happened in the outdoors of why, folks don't feel safe. That acknowledgement has to happen. At the same time, they also balance that acknowledgement with the legacies of our land, right? Of balancing with stories of goodness, and that, folks like my ancestors were absolutely excellent stewards of the land, right? They knew and understood how to do controlled burns and the value of those things. They knew and understood how to grow with practices that sequester carbon, right? And so it's not that we are so detached and that there's a gap because we just aren't interested, but that these things happened, but we also had a legacy of being connected to land in a way that supported the earth, right? And so we get to reclaim that and we get to move forward with those stories. So yeah, for me, the nature gap discussion loses sight of that, you know, these harmful things have happened that caused us to lose that connection. But there's opportunity to say, all right, let's acknowledge that, you know, those things were done to groups. And but prior to that, right, or even, you know, now there are people very much engaged in this space of reclaiming our stories, reclaiming how we take care of the planet, and have always, and many of us have continued to do that. That can be uplifted. So so I don't think of it as a nature gap. It's more so, you know, who is holding access, and who's and what kind of access do we get to have, which, to kind of address that too, you know, I think about where we have opportunities to engage with space, and being very intentional with that with organizations, right? So I'm talking this more so about Black land, right? Ownership, and how are we using those spaces to engage folks, right? So maybe the parks don't feel safe, but maybe someone's private land feels safe that we can work with, right? And so that's just one example, but so yeah, there's a lot of ways in which I think pretty differently about that conversation around nature gap.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate that kind of nuanced approach of thinking about it, because it can sometimes just feel like you were saying, that it's just, oh, well, they're not interested. No, it's not. That's not what's happening here. It's a little deeper than that. And so I think it also goes to the fact of, you know, something can be available to folks, but is it accessible? And I think, again, that goes to these are deeper conversations than sometimes just happens at the surface. And something that kind of leads into is that you've recently had a shift in language from culturally inclusive to culturally centered. And I think that's a really important conversation for us to have with the folks on this call. Can you discuss kind of why you felt that shift was important, and what these terms mean to you?
Yeah, so I think in January, I sent out a newsletter, and had just been reflecting a lot on, I would say, culturally inclusive. We want our stories to be included, right, in these spaces. And and it never actually quite set right with me from the beginning, but I was looking for language. I was saying culturally grounded, culturally relevant, culturally, all the things culturally, right? Culturally rooted, I think, was another one. But I settled on culturally inclusive. And but as I think about it more, I kept saying I want our stories to be centered, right? I don't want them to just be included. And as you'll see in a little bit, that kind of approach I use to designing programming is like it's centered, right? It's right there for us to talk about who these individuals were that stewarded the land. But also, who are the folks who are doing the work now, right? So this isn't just a past thing, this is also present, and uplifting that. So so yeah, culturally centered, that shift was just really important to change the language and mindset, I think, too, about we don't just want to be included, we want to be centered, because our work has been significant and critical in these spaces to where we are now. And I also think, as coming from early childhood background, if you're in the early childhood space, even in the disability space, inclusion is used a lot. And so what I was also noticing when I would talk to people, they would say, oh, you're doing work, you know, with folks who are disabled, getting them in the outdoors. And I said, well, of course, you know, we certainly want to provide voice to that, but that's not my background or necessarily expertise. And so it was also some of that happening to just clarify that it wasn't just on the disabilities community. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate that. And again, it kind of goes back to what you were talking about of this being a constant evolution and a constant conversation, even with yourself. I mean, you know, this is with ourselves, with each other, in community, learning from each other. And there's so much genius out there, and that it needs to be centered. And so I think that's a really wonderful way of putting it. So we have your presentation, which I'm excited to get into, because you're going to kind of get into the weeds a little bit about what you do. But is there anything that we missed that you want our audience to know before we move on? And then we'll also have hopefully a few questions at the end as well.
I'm sure as we go through the presentation, there may be some things that come up that might be some new highlights that I overlooked, but also as we answer some questions. So yeah.
Awesome. Great. Awesome. So why don't you start pulling that up? And just another reminder, I know you all were probably just listening to what Ashley was saying, but please make sure you put your questions in there for her to answer at the end. So we're excited about that.
Right. So I'm going to share just a brief slideshow, and we're going to start with a video that was created just to kind of give background of why I do the work that I do. So you may hear some things kind of reiterated that I've already said. But also just note that this video, there is some lag time, I think, on your end, but you can still hear the what I'm saying, I think, pretty on time. And so if you want to see this video, you can go to our YouTube channel, Unearthing Joy, and see it, and we'll share it out too after the presentation. So we will start that.
I grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina. My family, we were always kind of spending time outside in different places. So that's kind of how my love of the outdoors started. Let's see, after college, I moved around and ended up here in Nashville and taught in the school district 1st through 3rd grade and was a Montessori teacher. And so really loved, I think more so even working with families than just the children, and saw the value in that. So I went into working into higher ed because I wanted to teach teachers. I realized, that love for working with families, particularly Black and Latinx communities, was important. And so that's where my research focused on. So then we moved to Charleston, South Carolina. I was engaged in outdoor Afro for leisure, meeting people. And so I moved back to Nashville and realized there wasn't an outdoor Afro here. And so I became a volunteer leader. And so after some time, once I had my son, realized I wanted him to experience nature-based education. And when I looked at those programs and realized they were really white, but I wanted him to see himself reflected in these spaces like I did when I was doing outdoor Afro. We were very intentional about finding spaces that connected Black folks to nature with our stories. And so I thought, okay, how can I take what I know about early childhood education, what I know about what families want and what they need, and merge that with nature-based education. And that's really how the work with Unearthing Joy was kind of born, was taking this idea of the importance of stories in the outdoors to reconnect us, and not just us, but all people sharing our stories in nature. Yeah, if you want to walk in here, we'll try to walk in between the rows here. How does it feel? Is it cooler in here or warmer in here? It's warm, right? So the high tunnel allows us to have a longer growing season. So when it's getting cooler out there, we can still grow things in here that still like warmth. And in these little boxes, I just planted a cover crop to kind of regenerate this soil. So it's red clover growing in there. And in here as well. This used to be a regular front yard last year. And so then it was transitioned into being an herb garden. I would love to see more neighborhoods kind of create their own program, what they want it to look like. So whether we're providing the training for how to do it, but then they go and do their own thing and make it for what they want it to be. So I could, help with providing workshops and training for parents to do that. We don't need to own it. We don't need to be over it. I'd rather just share the knowledge, and then you can go and do your own programming. Head for home to get some rest and greet tomorrow ready and fresh. Our time together is the best. Yeah, it is. All are welcome here.
All right, so that just gives a little more information about what we do, and hopefully, let's see.
I grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina. My family, we were always kind of spending time.
Okay, so from here. All right, so like I shared already, about my background, but a lot of the work that I do, of course, was inspired by me growing up. And so really, I just want families and communities to have the opportunity to engage and find joy in nature throughout their own lives in a way that's relevant to them, right? So it doesn't always have to be, I always say, it doesn't always have to be a kayaking experience, a hiking experience, but whether it's just sitting outside and talking with friends and neighbors, that's a lot of what my grandparents did too. But really finding what that experience means for each of us is important. So honoring culture and exploring justice to unearth joy, that's a lot of the work that I do. And I think the justice part continues to emerge in how I approach the work and how we're doing the work. So we don't have it all figured out, right? There's many ways to go about doing this work. There's not just one. And so I just want to be able to share with folks some of the ways that we approach it. And some of the things that I do is ask communities, first of all, what counts as nature, right? It's different in every community, and we need to acknowledge that and be okay with that, and work with people with their own conceptions and what they enjoy doing, starting with that. And then thinking about who gets to engage, right? In your community, in their own communities, how are they invited to engage? Is it to do what you want them to do? Or is it something that's of interest to them first? And then where do people get to engage? That goes back to that land piece. Is it places that feel safe for them? Is it places that's close to their own homes? Or is it always to come to your parks? So really thinking about those questions as we approach our work, I think is important. And so, as I said, that story piece is so important. That story piece is so important. And here's an example of that. So where I do my work is at the programming is at Brooklyn Heights Community Garden in North Nashville. It's off of Trinity Lane in a neighborhood back there off the main road. And this is how powerful stories are. So I started volunteering there in June 2020. And since that time, it's really developed, in terms of space. We've had new structures go in. And so Ms. Pearl and I have become, good friends. And we went through a process. I started becoming, involved with the board, and I was chairing the board for almost 2 years. And last January, we started to revamp, the mission statement. So it was more bold, and the mission became to cultivate community, to grow food, to promote intergenerational learning, and to support creative play. Well, one of the board members, Kat, is a PhD student over at Vanderbilt, and her background and work that she's doing is kind of this exploring history in public spaces. And what she shared with us through her research was that the garden is located on Haynes Street behind Haynes Middle School. And Reverend Haynes was very instrumental in the Black community with providing land that he had inherited to several of the Black families in that community. And in this book, in the Tennessee Archives, that was written about him, was that his vision was for that area to be a food hub and to be a place where children could play, because he wasn't really allowed to play. It was all about work when he was growing up. And we didn't know that history before we changed the mission. So this is why I harpen on the fact that our stories our land has stories, and those stories are often blueprints for what we can do in our communities and the route, you know, we can go when we talk about improvement, when we talk about opportunity for communities. So just keeping in mind the power of stories is really real, and that legacy of the land is really important. So you've heard me talk about approaches that I use to create culturally centered program, and this is the lens through which I think, okay? When you think about your program, where you're working, or any program that you've attended at different places, or a curriculum you may be using, it usually is going to fall into these 4 categories. This is what Dr. James Banks talked about. And so I'm going to nerd out just for this one slide. But he usually said our curriculum, whether it's in a school, whether it's in a nature center, usually falls into this contributions approach if we're thinking about multiculturalism at all, right? It's like, okay, we're going to focus on heroes and holidays when it's MLK Day, or when it's Black History Month, or when it's Latinx History Month, right? That's kind of the contributions approach. You might lift a story or two about someone related to those specific dates. Well, then he says, level 2 is this additive approach. You might have content, concepts, themes, and perspectives that begin to explore that are added to the curriculum. It doesn't really change the curriculum, right? So you may say, oh, we need to add more books that feature, you know, more Black and brown characters, or you know, maybe we'll have certain times of the year where we'll add that to the curriculum, but we haven't really changed the structure of it. But then he says our goal should be, you know, let's look more in this transformation space, right? The curriculum is changed to enable students or participants to view concepts and events from different perspectives and different cultural groups. And so a book I often reference that I love is a book by Leah Penniman called Farming While Black. And to me, when she wrote that book, it was a very like transformative and a social action approach to that book and curriculum on how to grow food, how to farm, because it wasn't just about, I've been to Master Garden Program, like I mentioned, it's about, okay, you know, we're growing this plant, you plant the seed, it needs fertilizer, you know, that pretty, you know, stoic process. But what Leah talks about in her book is the cultural aspect of how we've grown food, Black folks, Indigenous folks, for forever, right? And that is important to the work that we're doing, the spiritual practices we engage in before we even put a seed in the ground, right? And then she provides some knowledge on the how-tos, right? But those stories are so super important, and that's a way of transforming and centering our work in farming. And then this social action approach, right? It's not just about what I'm doing with students in the after school program right now is it's not just about, we're talking about animal habitats and the loss of habitat in the North Nashville community, but then we say, well, what opportunities are there? What can we do to create more habitats, right? What are some things that we can explore? And so it's taking action, not just talking about the issues, but what can we do about it, even as young children? So that's the lens with which I approach my work. Do I always operate from the social action approach? Absolutely not, right? I see these kids once a week for 8 weeks. And so sometimes I might slide back into additive or contributions, but the goal is to really be in this space of this transformative way of doing our programming. And so it's a process in all of our learning. So what does some of our programming look like? This culturally inclusive, I still have inclusive in there, but culturally centered nature-based program for families. I mentioned, you know, my families come to the garden once a week for 8 weeks during the spring and then again in the fall. And we explore some different topics, and we have different people who've come to share with us. And so some of you may recognize Mr. Stewart there in the middle, but he's right here in Tennessee. And he came out and talked about the importance of protecting our oceans and even our local waterways. He has the Tennessee Aquatic Project, and he's a renowned diver and teaches youth to preserve the history of slave shipwrecks. So there's some archaeology that they do and he teaches them to dive. And so it's an incredible program. And so I intentionally find, people, Black and brown people in the Nashville community who are doing incredible work, and uplift their work and their stories and have them share. And then you see the little girl looking at the egg. So Miss Cynthia has come out and brought her chickens and birds, but she's a poultry farmer here. She went from, living in the north side of Chicago for many years and growing up there to 20 years ago, buying a farm in Nashville and raising poultry. And so just incredible people that are with us. And down at the right-hand corner is Angela, and she's fly fished all over the world, right? So I also try to find people who are doing things for leisure, but are shaping greatly who gets to do this work, and showing that it's, a lot of us are doing it in different ways. So some of our programs hasn't just been about gardening. Like, we don't just talk about gardening for the sake of growing things, but we talk about it in terms of food justice. Who gets access to food? Who doesn't? Why is that, right? And what can we do when we grow all this food in abundance to share it? And so we also did one called Skills for Liberation, a series. So I wanted to kind of reclaim that word wild and wilderness. A lot of us don't identify with that. That's kind of scary for some folks. And so, but when I put in the word liberation, people had a different reaction to that, right? They're like, yeah, I want to be liberated, right? But it's these same type of wilderness skills. How do you build a fire that our grandparents were doing? How do you build, well, my grandparents, we were, like I said, in rural areas. So we didn't have, central heating and air. They had the fireplace. And so skills like that, skills for what do we do with the herbs that are in our areas to treat and prevent illness. So all that knowledge that our ancestors had, that's what we talked about in that program and heard from different people. I think the other way in which many people can engage with nature that is cultural for a lot of us is through the arts. And so we did a creative arts in nature program. And so I had a guy came out and talked about photography as a way of being engaged in the outdoors, Deshaun Lewis, and had a musician who's a drummer who does a lot with around like African drumming and connections to nature, came out. So just a lot of different people. And this spring, we're actually exploring the animal kingdom. So I have some different folks, zookeepers, naturalists, one young lady who just loved reptiles and decided that's what she was going to share with people, and has a bus of reptiles. So the world of Reptile Girl, she'll be out sharing about her animals. So I think the important thing to note here is that we don't have to have all the knowledge. And I know I don't have all the knowledge. I think I shared that, I'm learning as I go in terms of the nature space. My strength is in the education space. And so I work a lot with identifying people who have knowledge. And these are just some of the community members, and even my parents, asking the parents what they know, right? And can share, and that we all have knowledge. Grandparents as well have done some things in our programs. And so Elizabeth Sanders was doing a presentation around food preservation. So not just canning, but also how meats have been dried, and how forever, cultures have preserved food in different ways. And one of my parents, Lolly, or she's going by Victoria now, is talking about the work that she does in her Mexican culture around preserving that, honoring the land, some different practices. And then that's a picture of Deshaun there. And all the kids had cameras. That was really fun. So, so yeah, these are just some different pictures of the things we've done with the children and families. And we continue to offer those immersive experiences. I do a lot of workshops with different organizations and through different platforms, and have long-term contracts with some of my clients. So Fresh Future Farm, if you're interested in folks doing radical food justice work. They are amazing. So, and I got them to do a Farm Babies program. So it's, I'm learning from them and they're learning from me. And so they're doing a program right now for children and families called Farm Babies. So that's been fun. And these are just some upcoming experiences that we have. Y'all are, if you're interested in the morning enrichment or after school enrichment program in any way, you know, feel free to reach out and visit us. And Brooklyn Heights Community Garden, they'll have an open house March 22nd. And I'm doing an unconference for Black women outdoor educators the first weekend in May. And that really is to create space for us to have really authentic conversation about our knowledge. That's usually rooted in justice, but also healing as well. So I will pause there and happy to take any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And we do have a few questions in the Q&A, so I'll go ahead and just fire them off for you. All right, so first one, do you have any other educators or resources you recommend? You mentioned already a lot of really great resources, but any others that you wanna plug for us?
Yeah, I think one of the books that I often uplift is one called Multicultural Strategies. And I utilize a lot of her strategies, multicultural strategies in the early childhood classroom. And really you can use those same strategies with adults. But it's by Mariana Soto Manning. So multicultural strategies in the early childhood classroom. Mariana Soto Manning. I think it's a really great book to check out. Socialjusticebooks.org is wonderful because they curate lists of high quality multicultural literature that they vet for, you know, making sure that it's written by Black and Brown authors, but they also have like specific books about nature, about food justice, about, you know, all kind of topic art. I've looked at their list for that. So that's another great resource to check out. And stay tuned because I've noticed this question a lot, like who are some of the people in Nashville? And I know several folks who are doing really great work. And so we're kind of looking at creating a collective where if you wanted some of the folks I've worked with to come out to your programming or do programming, we're looking into kind of creating this collective where you could, we'll coordinate that for you. So just kind of stay tuned to be on the lookout for that.
Thanks so much. Your wealth of knowledge. All right. The next question from Joanne. She wants to know if you've heard of Sierra Club's Inspiring Connections Outdoors program. They have summer outdoor programs for youth geared toward inner city.
I haven't. I know there's several initiatives that are coming out, but I'll certainly take note of that and look into it.
All right. And then next one, and you've kind of mentioned this already, but another opportunity if there are any other folks you've missed. But who are some of your inspirations for this work?
Yeah, I think my son, you know, first and foremost, I don't know that I would have gone this route without seeing his aha moments in nature. And then of course, a lot of the folks who are doing the culturally responsive teaching work and education are big inspirations for how they approach their work. And so I mentioned Dr. James Banks, but there's just several, Mariana Soto Manning, even my colleagues who, a really good colleague of mine and friend who's doing incredible work with Indigenous communities, with creating their own like inquiries or research, like training them to be the researchers, the community to be the research. Terajeen Yazi Mintz has a project with the Touch Points. Is it Touch? Anyway, it's a group out of Boston that's connected to Harvard in some way. but she's doing incredible work. And I have a friend who does some work around language justice. So even looking at how our programs are being inclusive of folks who are not English speakers. We're looking at more of that work as well. So lots of people. I can go on and on, but lots of people.
And because we're right at 1, I want to take this opportunity to remind everyone that we will continue to go until 1:15, and any of the resources and information that Ashley is sharing, all of her inspirations and all of these great mentions will be included in Christina and mine's follow-up email after this webinar, with links to all of those, as well as the link to the recording where you can find that on YouTube. And wanted to also give a shout out to our next episode in April. On April 12th, we will be hosting some folks to talk about bees. So very exciting stuff. And we hope that you can stay on with us for the next 15 minutes. But if you have to jump off because it's at that 1 hour of your lunch break, it's totally understand. You can catch up on the rest of this from the recording. All right, so moving on to the next one. Have you engaged with the Indigenous community? And I'm thinking this is specifically in Middle Tennessee.
Yeah, that's, thank you for asking that question. That's something that I continuously want to do and work on. I've mentioned the Native American Association for Tennessee, and that's kind of been the one area that I keep wanting to have entrance into, and our schedules just hasn't worked out in terms of, because I always start with volunteering my time with folks, because I never want to be extractive. And then if it feels, like there's some connection there to share with one another, I move in that way. But, if you have, I'm always open to connections with folks. And so if you have individuals you think would be great to connect with, I certainly would appreciate those connections. But that's one of the groups I'm still trying to chip away at engaging with, and hope to continue to do that.
That's great. And mutual connections are always good. If we can all kind of work together to share the different people we know, we can get a lot farther.
Absolutely.
All right. This next question, so 2 parts. One is, how are you funded, and will you be doing community gardens in other parts of town? So as you're comfortable sharing, how are you funded?
Yeah, no, I think that's an important question. So a lot of my work is funded by organizations that contract with me. And so the long-term contracts are really what sustains me. And then with Fresh Future Farm, doing programming development work for them and fundraising work, as well as another big initiative is in Charleston too, Tri-County Play Collaborative, and we coordinate outdoor experiences for them. And now with also Brooklyn Heights Community Garden, we were able to be get seed funding to fund me as well. And then I have organizations, I call it the cherry on top, who reach out for the workshops. And so those are all kind of folks that I charge, because I'm not a nonprofit, I am an LLC. And then the children who come, they pay a fee, but it's not a big fee, and it's not, it doesn't pay me. I do that mostly just as to have, like I said in the beginning, continued connection to children and families. But those are some of the ways in which I'm funded. And then was there a second part to that question?
Yeah, and also wanted to mention, I did see on your website that you have a sliding scale for some, or it was one workshop that I saw, it was a sliding scale. So it was, I appreciate that you include that in as an offering. It's, yeah, I appreciate that. And then the second part is, will you be doing community gardens in other parts of town?
No, and it's for the reason I shared in that video was, I don't want to be the holder of knowledge. I think the way we continue to spread joy and the way we continue to spread knowledge is when we share it, and then people go implement it for what's needed in their community. like even North Nashville is different from what's needed in South Nashville, right? And so I was talking to a couple of folks the other day. They're doing community gardens in South Nashville. And what we may do is, just have a conversation to share some knowledge and resources around like community organizing. But for me to go and implement that actual gardening program is not, number one, of interest to me, but also like beyond my capacity. But I would absolutely love to do some training around what is, gardening for food justice type of work look like with children and communities, and allow people who are interested garden educators to come and engage in that, so you can take it back to your school.
And that made me think of a question that I actually had when you were presenting. You mentioned partnerships, and you've mentioned, is it Fresh City Farm?
Fresh Future Farm.
Fresh Future Farm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have are there any other organizations in and around Nashville that you partner with, or organizations that, you have kind of in the back of your mind as potential future partners for your work?
Locally, I'm always looking at who might be, of interest to be partners. I've been looking more so nationally at some different initiatives like Farm to Early Childhood, which comes out of farm to school work, and doing a little work with them, and a couple other early childhood folks. But, I would love to get in with the Parks and Rec. Has been of interest to me locally, and they're doing some good programming already. I think there's some other things that would be really cool to do that focuses on families in terms of outdoor recreation, because that programming has to look a little different. And so so that's probably the one that comes top of mind for who I would love to do some partnership with. But there's been, I've done some work with Maddox Fund, and there's a few others, and they're just escaping me right now. But and of course, Brooklyn Heights Community Garden. But yeah, I'm always open to hearing ideas for partnerships. So if you have some, reach out.
Thank you for entertaining my question. Another question, have you had positive outcomes and good participation from people of color with your programs?
Yeah, so I would say in the morning, if we're talking about the programs for children and families, at the height, which was, before everything opened back up, I would say our programs were pretty diverse, half and half, right, in terms of people of color and white families. What was interesting was seeing a lot of multiracial families engage as they were looking for community for their children. And as far as like the trainings and workshops, my two biggest contracts are with Black-led organizations. So I think we're very much engaged in the work in different ways, and looking to have more people who are doing this work with intention, who can help lead and guide our organization. So the interest is definitely there for folks. Sometimes it's an issue of funding often. So I work with a lot of nonprofits, so we have to navigate, and do some fundraising together sometimes. And so, but yeah, my biggest supporters are actually the organizations that are led by people of color, because I don't have to explain why it's important often to them. So yeah.
And that's interesting. You mentioned that there are some multiracial families that are that have been in your programs, and just interesting to see who comes and finds these spaces, and their desire to introduce their children, if it's a family program, to the space you're curating. Okay, two more questions. Is your programming related to Goldie Mohammed's book, Unearthing Joy? Or I guess your title for your organization name, not title.
I just found out about her book a couple of weeks ago. And which is so funny. I changed the name to Unearthing Joy last January. And her book just came out, right? So it's interesting if you don't know about this book, 'cause I want to get a copy of it and actually reach out to her. It's pretty serendipitous because the book you're referring to, for those who don't know, is all about like culturally responsive teaching. And she titled it Unearthing Joy. So, I need to talk with her. So
It seems like that's a partnership.
Right? Exactly. And she's, I think, a professor. I can't remember at what university, but I was like, we need to talk. So, but no, it's very coincidental.
That's great. All right, final question, and we'll keep it on a kind of a broad note here at the end. So what are your goals for the future? What are you looking ahead toward?
Oh, that's a good question. I would love to continue to see organizations invest in the workshops for how to create culturally centered programs. I would love to see, that's my big dream, is to see like a national parks organization, like someone with a big umbrella, state parks system to invest in those workshops for their staff. And then to kind of follow the researcher in me, to kind of follow like, how do they actually implement it, and whether they actually implement, and what does it look like? And then what are the lessons learned? Because it's not all rosy, right? It can be messy in terms of how to implement what you need to change and all these things along the way. So I would love to, be able to do some training, but then like evaluation piece to it, and continue to follow the work that they're doing in terms of, those outcomes and implementation.
That's fantastic. I hope to see a National Park Service collaboration. All of that. All right.
We'll manifest
it.
We'll all say national parks, come on. I'm sure they're listening, so they come for that
we'll send this recording. Well, please give some love to our panelist, Ashley Brailsford, in the chat. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode, Ashley.
Yeah, thank you all so much. And like I said, here's some information. Feel free to reach out. And if you just want to see the work we're doing, you can certainly follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Unearthing Joy Together.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ashley. This was a real pleasure to listen to, and we appreciate your time and your expertise and your passion. So thank you again. Thank you everyone who came and spent their lunch break with us. This recording will be up, and you can expect our follow-up email, and we'll CC Ashley on there since she's already given her information. So I think that's okay. And you can feel free to reach out to her. So thank you. And we'll see you in April for some bees.
Absolutely. Thank you all.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Bye.